It was just another late afternoon in the small town of Riverwood. Nestled in the heart of Pennsylvania, the sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm, golden hue across the landscape. The river, which ran through the heart of the town, flowed lazily beneath the old iron bridge that connected the two sides of the community. The sounds of birds chirping and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees created a sense of peace. But for Jake, a 14-year-old boy who spent most of his time fishing by the river, peace had become a rare commodity. Jake's life had changed ever since his father passed away in a tragic car accident 2 years ago. His mother, Lisa, had worked tirelessly to make ends meet, taking up double shifts at the local diner. They lived in a modest home, barely scraping by, but Jake didn't complain. Fishing had become his refuge, a place where he could drown out the noise of his life, if only for a little while. That evening, as he sat on the riverbank, the rhythmic pull of the fishing line in his hands was interrupted by a loud noise, a thud that echoed through the trees. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He instinctively ducked behind the tall grasses, peering through the thick reeds. There, just ahead of him, a black sedan had stopped in the middle of the bridge. The car's engine idled quietly, and a man emerged from the driver's side. He was tall, sharply dressed in a dark suit, and had an air of urgency about him. Jake watched in stunned silence as the man walked toward the railing of the bridge. His breath caught when the man leaned over, and without any hesitation, he shoved something, or someone, over the edge. The splash that followed was deafening, and for a split second, Jake wondered if it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But no, there was no mistaking it. Someone had just been thrown into the river. Jake's heart raced as the sedan sped off, the screech of its tires reverberating through the air. He stood frozen, his pulse pounding in his ears. The current was strong, and the river was unforgiving. Whoever had been thrown over wasn't going to survive long if no one helped. Without thinking, Jake kicked off his shoes, grabbed his fishing rod, and sprinted down the muddy bank. The sharp rocks dug into his bare feet, but he barely noticed as he reached the water's edge. The current was faster than he had expected, and for a moment, Jake hesitated, but then he saw it, someone, floating face down in the water. It was an older man, his clothes soaked and his body limp. Jake's mind screamed at him to get help, but the nearest town was miles away, and the man didn't have much time. He couldn't just let him drown. "Come on, Jake, come on," he muttered to himself, his voice trembling. His hands shook as he dove into the river, the cold water instantly seizing his breath. He fought against the current, his arms and legs flailing as he pushed himself toward the man. Every muscle in his body screamed for rest, but he couldn't stop, not now. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jake reached the man. He gritted his teeth, determined to save him, but the older man's weight was overwhelming. Jake could feel himself being pulled deeper into the water, his lungs screaming for air. The struggle seemed endless, but he didn't give up. With one final surge of strength, he kicked toward the shore, dragging the man through the churning water. His fingers scraped against the muddy bank, and with a last, desperate push, he managed to haul the man onto the grassy shore. Jake collapsed beside the man, gasping for air, his heart still racing. He looked down at the stranger, his face pale and gaunt, a deep gash on his temple. Blood trickled down the man's face, and Jake's stomach turned at the sight. He could feel the panic rising in his chest. The man wasn't breathing normally. He was still alive, but barely. "Come on, old man," Jake whispered, his voice shaky as he patted the man's chest. "Stay with me," but the man's breath was shallow, and his eyes were closed. Jake's mind raced. He had to get help, but he had left his phone at home. The nearest hospital was over an hour away, and there was no way the man could survive that long. There was only one choice. "I'll get you to my mom," Jake said, his voice firm despite his fear. He stood up, staggering under the man's weight, and started walking toward home, his footsteps slow but determined. His mind was a blur, but there was no time to waste. His mother would know what to do. She had to. Jake barely remembered the walk home. Every step was a blur as he focused entirely on keeping the man he had dragged from the river alive. The sun was now sinking below the horizon, casting the world in a dim, golden light. His legs were numb from the cold, and his arms ached under the weight of the stranger. But he pushed through. He couldn't think about anything except getting the man to safety. By the time he reached the front door of his small house, Jake was gasping for breath, his knees buckling slightly as he pushed the door open. The familiar smell of dinner wafted out to meet him, spaghetti and garlic bread. A warm comfort that felt miles away from the chaos of the river. His mother, Lisa, was in the kitchen, her back turned as she scrubbed a pot. "Mom," Jake's voice was frantic as he staggered into the living room, barely able to hold the man up any longer. "Mom, help!" Lisa spun around at the sound of his voice, her eyes widening in alarm as she saw the unconscious man slumped in Jake's arms. "Jake, what is this? What happened?" Her voice cracked with disbelief. But without hesitation, she dropped the pot and rushed over. I found him by the river. Someone threw him off the bridge. I pulled him out," Jake panted, his voice shaking with the adrenaline that was now beginning to wear off. He barely managed to guide the man to the worn-out sofa before he collapsed beside him. Catching his breath, Lisa knelt beside the man, her brow furrowing as she quickly assessed the situation. His clothes were soaked through, his body pale and stiff, but there was a faint rise and fall of his chest. "We need to get him to a hospital," she said, her voice sharp as she looked at Jake. "Do you have your phone? Call 911. Jake froze for a moment, the panic rising in his chest once again. His phone. He'd left it by the riverbank. "I don't have it," Jake muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't think." Lisa let out a frustrated sigh, but her expression softened when she saw the fear in her son's eyes. Okay, we can't waste any time." She glanced around, thinking fast. "The closest hospital is an hour away. Jake, we don't have that much time. I'll do what I can here, but we need to keep him stable." She hurried to the cabinet and grabbed the first aid kit, setting it down beside the man. Jake hovered over her, his hands trembling as he watched her work. Lisa cleaned the gash on the man's temple, her movements quick and efficient, but there was a quiet concern in her eyes. "Who is he?" Jake asked softly, watching her as she worked. Lisa shook her head. "I don't know. I don't recognize him, but this is serious. Jake, we need to get him help. And fast. His pulse is weak, and if we don't do something, we're going to lose him." Jake nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His mind raced back to the moment he saw the man thrown from the bridge. Why had someone done that? Who was he, and why had Jake been the one to save him? The questions swirled in his mind, but for now, all he could do was help his mom with the man. After a few minutes, Lisa stepped back, wiping her hands on a towel. "He's stable for now. His pulse is weak, but it's steady." She looked at Jake, her brow furrowed. "But this doesn't make sense. Someone threw him off a bridge, and no one has reported anything. Where's the police? Why didn't anyone see anything?" Jake opened his mouth to respond, but just as he did, the evening news came on. The anchor's voice filled the room, offering a brief respite from the tension that had settled over them. Breaking news tonight: Richard Foster, a well-known businessman and philanthropist, has been reported missing. Foster, known for his leadership in the Foster Foundation, was last seen leaving his estate earlier this morning. His car was found abandoned near the Riverway Bridge, where authorities suspect foul play. Lisa froze, her hand still on the towel. Jake's eyes widened as he glanced at the screen. There, in the image accompanying the report, was a man with sharp features, silver hair, and a familiar expression. His face was identical to the man lying unconscious on their couch. "That's him," Jake said in a low voice, his breath catching in his throat. "That's the man I pulled from the river. His name is Richard Foster." Lisa stared at the screen, her heart racing. What in the world? This man, he's a billionaire. Why was he thrown off a bridge? She glanced back at the unconscious man, her mind racing. Jake, we need to figure out what happened. But we can't tell anyone about this. Not yet. Do you understand? Jake nodded, but the weight of the situation was settling in. The man they had saved wasn't just a stranger, he was someone important. Someone with resources. And yet, he had been discarded like nothing more than trash. The pieces didn't fit, and the questions kept piling up. They sat in silence for a few moments, the room heavy with the sound of the news anchor's voice in the background. But it wasn't long before the silence was broken again, this time by the soft groan of the man on the couch. Is he? Jake began, his voice tinged with hope. Lisa leaned in closer, her hands trembling as she reached for the man's wrist to check his pulse. It was still faint, but stronger than before. He's alive, she whispered. Barely, but he's alive. Just then, the man's eyes fluttered open. His gaze was unfocused at first, but as he tried to lift his head, a low groan escaped his lips. Where am I? He murmured hoarsely. You're in my home, Lisa said gently, kneeling beside him. My son, Jake, found you by the river. You were hurt, but you're safe now. The man blinked slowly, his mind struggling to make sense of his surroundings. His face contorted in pain as he raised a trembling hand to his head. Wincing at the touch of the bandage. The river, his voice trailed off. Who did this to me? Jake exchanged a glance with his mother. The man clearly didn't remember what had happened. It was as if he had no recollection of the events that led him to the bridge. I don't know, Jake said softly, but we're going to figure it out. You're safe here. The man's eyes cleared a little as he focused on Jake, then on Lisa. His lips twitched into the faintest of smiles. Thank you, he rasped. Thank you both. The hours seemed to stretch on in a blur. Lisa sat next to the stranger, tending to his needs and keeping a watchful eye on his condition. Jake, on the other hand, was trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who was this man, and why had someone thrown him into the river like that? The evening news kept playing in the background, reporting on Richard Foster's disappearance. As more details surfaced, the situation only became more complicated. The man they had saved, the one lying unconscious on their couch, was not just any stranger, he was someone wealthy, someone with power, and someone who could have enemies. Richard Foster had been one of the wealthiest men in Pennsylvania, known for his charity work and his role as the head of the Foster Foundation. His name had been in the news countless times, always praised for his generosity and leadership. But now, his name was linked to something darker. The news anchors were speculating about his disappearance and possible foul play. But no one seemed to know what had happened. Jake sat quietly in the corner, his mind racing with questions. He had saved a billionaire, a man whose face was plastered across the news, a man with connections and resources. How was it possible that someone would want to kill him? I should have called the police, Jake muttered to himself, pacing in the small living room. The weight of the decision to take Richard home instead of calling 911 was starting to settle in. What if they were making things worse? What if they were putting themselves in danger? Jake, calm down, Lisa said, her voice firm as she finished tending to the bandage on Richard's head. We did what we had to do. Calling the authorities now might not be the safest thing. Not until we understand what's really going on. Jake stopped pacing and looked at his mother. She was right. The situation was complicated, and rushing into things could make it worse. They didn't even know if anyone was looking for Richard. If they called the police too soon, they might draw the attention of people who shouldn't know where Richard was. Richard stirred on the couch again, his eyes blinking open slowly. He looked groggy, but his mind was slowly coming back to him. What happened? He asked in a hoarse voice, his words still slurred. You were thrown off the bridge, Lisa said gently, her voice low but steady. But you're safe now. We've been taking care of you. You've been unconscious for a while. Richard blinked, confusion washing over his face as he tried to sit up. The bridge, he repeated, his voice fading. I remember driving, and then A car. Another car. His voice trailed off as if he was struggling to piece together the puzzle. Jake watched intently, trying to make sense of Richard's fragmented memories. He could tell that the man was struggling, his mind cloudy from the shock of what had happened. But Jake also noticed something in Richard's expression, a flash of recognition. It was him, wasn't it? Richard said suddenly, his eyes narrowing as his mind seemed to clear. It was my son-in-law, Alan. Jake's breath caught in his throat. Alan. He'd heard that name somewhere before. The news report had mentioned something about a billionaire's family, but it hadn't gone into detail. He hadn't known that Richard Foster had a son-in-law, let alone someone who might want to kill him. Your son-in-law? Lisa asked, her voice low. She seemed both surprised and cautious. What are you saying? Why would he? Richard's face twisted with bitterness, and he let out a dry, humorless laugh. Because of money. Greed. Alan's been siphoning money from my accounts for years. I've been trying to catch him in the act, but he's too careful. When I confronted him, when I laid out all the evidence, he snapped. He lost control. He thought if he got rid of me, no one would ever know what he'd done. Jake could barely believe what he was hearing. Richard Foster's son-in-law had been embezzling money from him, and when confronted, he tried to kill him. It was almost too much to process. But one thing was clear, this wasn't just an ordinary crime. This was personal. Why didn't you call the police? Lisa asked, her voice softening with concern. Why go after him on your own? Richard's eyes flickered with a mixture of regret and anger. Because I didn't want anyone to know. Alan's got connections. If I went to the authorities without proof, he could have turned it all around on me. I had to gather the evidence first. Is that why he attacked you? Jake asked, his voice trembling with the weight of the revelation. Because you found out about the money? Richard nodded slowly. Yes, I didn't want to believe it at first. I thought it was a mistake. But when I saw the transactions, when I saw how deep it went, I knew I couldn't let it slide. But Alan, he's dangerous. He knew what I would do. Lisa crossed her arms, her brow furrowed with concern. And now you're telling us this man, Alan, is coming after you. Richard closed his eyes, his face weary. I don't know, but I need time to figure out how to handle this. I can't go to the police without evidence. And I can't let Alan know I'm still alive. Lisa and Jake exchanged a look. This was getting more complicated by the minute. They weren't just dealing with a random crime. They were involved in something much bigger. Richard Foster's life was on the line, and so, it seemed, was their own. We'll help you, Jake said, his voice firm. Whatever it takes, we'll help you get the evidence you need. Richard gave him a weak smile, gratitude mixed with exhaustion in his eyes. Thank you, you've already done more than I could have ever asked. But as Jake looked at the man lying on the couch, he knew this was only the beginning. The danger wasn't over yet. And the more they learned about Richard's past, the more questions they had. Could they trust the authorities? What would happen if Alan found out they were hiding Richard? Jake's stomach churned at the thought. The night passed in silence, and the weight of the situation seemed to press down harder with each passing minute. They had saved Richard's life, but now they were all in this together. They couldn't turn back. The next few days felt like they passed in a haze. Richard was slowly recovering, but his memory remained clouded. He spent most of his time resting, sipping the light teas that Lisa prepared for him. His face still pale but no longer as ghostly as when he first arrived. Jake and his mother did everything they could to keep him stable. But the feeling of danger hung in the air like an invisible fog. As Richard grew stronger, he became more restless. He would sit up on the couch, staring out the window, as if waiting for something, or someone. But nothing happened. No one came looking for him. And the police didn't show up at their door. The quiet was unnerving, like the calm before the storm. Jake spent his days trying to keep busy. But the thoughts of what he had witnessed, the man being thrown off the bridge, the mysterious figures involved, and the name Alan, kept him awake at night. He couldn't shake the image of Richard's face. The man who had been betrayed by his own flesh and blood. And now, they were all caught in the middle of a web of lies, greed, and danger. One evening, after dinner, Jake couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed his coat and stepped outside, needing some air. The crisp autumn air bit at his skin, but it was a relief to be away from the tense atmosphere inside the house. He walked along the quiet street, his footsteps echoing on the cracked pavement. The street lights cast long shadows, and the world felt eerily still. That was when he saw it. A black car, sleek and shiny, parked a few houses down. Jake's heart raced as he stared at it. It was the same car he had seen on the bridge the night Richard was thrown into the river. He hadn't seen it since, but now it was here, parked quietly on his street. Jake's instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet were frozen in place. Was it a coincidence, or was someone watching them? He turned and hurried back to the house, his mind racing. The car didn't belong in this neighborhood. It didn't belong in their lives. When he got home, he found Lisa in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner. Richard was sitting on the couch, his eyes distant, lost in thought. "Mom," Jake said, his voice trembling, "there's a black car outside. It's parked down the street. It's the same car, the one I saw on the bridge when Richard was thrown in." Lisa's eyes widened, and her hand froze mid-motion as she wiped the counter. She exchanged a look with Richard, who had now become fully alert, his expression sharpening. "Stay here, Jake," Lisa said quickly, her voice steady despite the obvious concern in her eyes. "I'll check it out. Don't go near that car. Do you understand?" Jake nodded, but his stomach churned with unease. He could feel the danger creeping closer, the walls of their small home slowly closing in. It wasn't just a matter of saving Richard anymore. It was about surviving whatever was coming their way. Lisa grabbed her coat and stepped outside. Jake watched through the window as she walked cautiously toward the car, her posture tense but deliberate. She approached it slowly, her eyes scanning the street, the air thick with tension. Seconds passed, and Jake could feel every moment drag by. What if the people in the car were watching her? What if she was in danger too? He pressed his hand to the window, his pulse quickening as he watched her approach the vehicle. Just as Lisa was about to reach the car, the door opened. A man stepped out, tall, well-dressed, and wearing dark sunglasses. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He didn't recognize him, but there was something about the man's demeanor that made Jake's skin crawl. "Mom," Jake whispered under his breath, taking a step back from the window. He had to warn her, but as he turned to leave the room, something stopped him. Richard, who had been sitting quietly on the couch, was now on his feet. His eyes were fixed on the scene outside, his gaze intense and unwavering. "No, don't go," Richard said, his voice low. "You can't let her go out there. He's one of Alan's men. I know him." Jake froze, his eyes wide with shock. "Alan's men? What are they doing here?" Richard's face hardened, his jaw clenched. "They're looking for me," he said quietly, his voice tinged with regret. "They'll stop at nothing to find me. If they think I'm alive, they'll come for me." Lisa had stopped just a few feet away from the car now. Her eyes narrowed as she sized up the man who had stepped out. The car's door remained open, but the man hadn't moved toward her yet. He stood still, watching her, waiting. Then, without warning, he started walking toward her. "Mom," Jake urged, panic flooding his chest. Lisa turned and glanced over her shoulder, meeting Jake's eyes through the window. She gave a slight nod, as if to reassure him that she was okay, at least for the moment. But Jake could tell from her expression that she was ready. She was about to confront whoever this was, whoever was looking for Richard. She took another step forward, her body language calm but controlled, her gaze never leaving the man as he drew closer. The man stopped just a few feet away, his hands slipping into the pockets of his jacket. "You're the one who's been helping Richard Foster," the man said, his voice cold and measured. Lisa didn't flinch. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice steady but her eyes sharp. "I'm just a mother trying to keep my family safe." The man's lips curled into a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm afraid it's not that simple. Mom, you've been harboring a fugitive. And that's not something we can overlook." Lisa stepped back, her eyes narrowing as she calculated her next move. Jake's heart raced as he watched the scene unfold. He couldn't hear their words, but he could see the tension rising between them. The man was dangerous, and Lisa wasn't backing down. Just then, the sound of another car pulling up broke the tension. Lisa's head snapped around, and in that brief moment of distraction, the man's attention shifted. His hand moved toward the inside of his jacket, toward something Jake couldn't see. The man froze as the other car's headlights cut through the darkness, casting long shadows across the street. The door to the car opened, and another figure stepped out. This time, it was someone Jake didn't recognize. But the change in the air was immediate. The situation had just escalated. The air was thick with tension as the second man stepped out of the car. He was older, his graying hair combed neatly, but the hard look in his eyes betrayed his calm exterior. The first man, still standing near Lisa, shifted uncomfortably as if trying to assess the new arrival. It was clear from the way they exchanged glances that this was not just a casual encounter, this was serious. Lisa's posture remained firm, her eyes flicking between the two men, every muscle in her body alert. Jake, watching from the window, felt a wave of dread wash over him. His heart hammered in his chest as he realized just how deep they were in now. This wasn't just about a man being thrown off a bridge anymore, it was about survival. Richard's life, his family's safety, and now his own had become entwined in a dangerous game that no one was ready for. The older man, who had just arrived, took a few steps forward, his gaze never leaving Lisa. "I'm James," he said in a low, gravelly voice, "and you must be the woman who's been hiding Richard Foster." There was no question in his tone, only certainty. It was as though he already knew everything. Lisa's expression hardened, but she didn't back down. "I'm not hiding anyone," she replied evenly, "but if you're here for trouble, you've come to the wrong place." James' lips curled into a slight smile. It wasn't a friendly smile, but it was enough to send a chill down Jake's spine. "I'm not here for trouble, Mom. I'm here to resolve a situation. A very complicated situation, and I'm afraid you've gotten tangled up in it." "Resolve?" Lisa raised an eyebrow, her voice cold. "By threatening my family?" James held up his hands in mock surrender. "No threats, just facts. You're harboring a fugitive, and that's something Alan won't tolerate. He'll burn everything down to get what he wants." His eyes shifted to the black sedan that had been parked down the street. The car that had followed them here. "And I'm afraid he's not the only one looking for Richard Foster." The first man, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "We just need to know where he is," he said, his tone more impatient than before. "Give us Foster, and we'll be on our way." Lisa's eyes flicked to the house behind them, where Richard was still resting on the couch. She could feel the weight of the situation pressed down on her like a 1,000-pound stone. It was clear these men weren't going to leave without something, and they wouldn't hesitate to escalate things if they didn't get what they wanted. But Lisa wasn't going to give in without a fight. "I don't know where Richard is," she said, her voice calm but sharp. "But if you lay one finger on my son, or on this house, I'll make sure you regret it." For a moment, the street was silent except for the distant sound of wind rustling through the trees. The two men exchanged another look, their eyes narrowing. They weren't here for a casual conversation. They were here to find Richard, and they wouldn't stop until they did. The older man, James, took a step forward, his demeanor now more serious. "You're making a mistake, Mom. Alan doesn't care about your family. He cares about one thing, keeping his secrets buried." He paused, letting the words sink in. "If you don't help us, we'll find another way to get to him." Lisa's face softened slightly, but her eyes never left the man in front of her. She wasn't giving an inch. "You're not going to get anything from me. Not without a fight." At that moment, Jake's heart skipped a beat. His hand instinctively reached for the door handle, his body tensing as he realized the situation was reaching its breaking point. His eyes shifted to Richard, who was now standing in the doorway, leaning heavily on the frame. Richard's face was pale, but his eyes were sharp with determination. "It's okay, Lisa," Richard said, his voice raspy but steady. "I'm here." The men turned in surprise, their eyes widening when they saw Richard standing in the doorway. The tension in the air was almost palpable as Richard slowly walked toward them, his steps unsteady but firm. "You're alive," James said, his voice a mix of disbelief and relief. "We thought you were dead." "I was," Richard said quietly, his eyes narrowing, "but I'm not anymore, and if you're looking for me, you'll have to get through me first." Lisa stepped back, a surge of protective instinct sweeping over her as Richard moved to the front of the house. She knew the situation had escalated beyond anything they could handle. The man she had saved, the stranger who had stumbled into their lives, was no longer just a victim, he was a threat. And now, so was she and Jake. The two men, James and the other man, shared a brief glance before the older man spoke again, his voice cold and calculating. "You've got guts, Foster, I'll give you that, but you can't hide forever. Alan has people everywhere." Richard didn't flinch. "And I'm not running anymore. You tell Alan that if he wants me, he can come find me. But this time, he'll have to answer for what he's done." The words hung in the air like a declaration, a challenge. Lisa's eyes widened in realization. Richard wasn't just trying to survive anymore, he was preparing for war. A war against his own family, against the man who had betrayed him, and they were all caught in the middle of it. The silence was broken by the sudden roar of engines in the distance. Lisa, Richard, and Jake all turned as the unmistakable sound of approaching vehicles reached their ears. More cars, more people. It wasn't just James and his companion anymore. They had company, and that company had come to finish what had been started. "James," the first man said, his voice tight with urgency. "We've got to move." James looked back at Lisa and Richard, a calculating look in his eyes. "This isn't over," he said grimly, then turned and headed back to the car. His companion followed closely behind. And in a few moments, the two men were gone, their black sedan driving off into the night. Lisa exhaled sharply, her body trembling as the adrenaline began to fade. "What do we do now?" she whispered, turning to Richard. Richard met her gaze, his expression hard but resolute. "We prepare. Alan is coming, and when he does, we're ready." Jake stood silently behind them, watching the last of the men disappear into the night. The weight of everything that had happened felt heavier now, and for the first time, Jake realized just how much had changed in such a short time. He wasn't just a bystander anymore. He was part of this. And whatever came next, he would have to be ready.